No matter what weather you may have had this past week, and I hope everybody is safe and warm, but whatever weather you may have had, it is Sunshine Week here in the great state of Wisconsin. It also happens to be Sunshine Week all across the nation. Sunshine Week, for those of you who are not aware of it, is that week which journalists and citizens come together to celebrate transparency, the transparency that we have in our government or the lack thereof, as the case may be. Generally speaking, over the past several decades, the decline in transparency has been great. It has been a downward trend. It is sad all across the United States for the most part, and it is particularly sad to see government close its doors to the process of what goes on in our government the way it has in Wisconsin. Wisconsin led the way in establishing open records and open meetings laws. It was once the proud leader of transparency in the United States, and it is no longer the case. Now, I document all of this in a book that I wrote in 2021 and released right after the pandemic. It's called Dark State. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now our Secretary of Health and Human Services, was gracious enough to write the jacket copy for it. I appreciate that. And I'm not trying to hawk the book, but that book gives you the sad tale of how we have descended into darkness. We talk about the deep state so much, but we really have a dark state. And it's not just Wisconsin, it's all across the country. And this year, at the Lakeland Times, we always do sunshine grades. We grade the various public figures around the states, and we see more and more Fs rather than As, and it was no different this year. But I want to bring up one incident that occurred that became obvious and in the media over the last several months, and that's the case of Wisconsin Eye. Now, many of you are familiar with Wisconsin Eye. It is Wisconsin's version of C-SPAN. It offers an unfiltered look at what is going on in our state government. It has thousands and thousands, I think something like 18,000 hours of archived meetings that they record. They live stream and you can go back in and watch them. They cover Supreme Court hearings. They cover the press conferences of politicians. They cover legislative sessions and committee hearings and public hearings. If you want to know and see what your government is doing, what bills they're about to pass, Wisconsin Eye has been an indispensable tool for journalists over the last 20 years, almost, since they were founded in 2007. It has not only been an indispensable tool for those of us who work in journalism, but for many citizens around the state who want to be involved, who want to see what's going on, who want to participate because they can actually then contact their legislators if they don't like something they see or if they do like something they see. So if you're in a remote part of the state and you can't get to Madison for all these hearings, then Wisconsin Eye has been your lifeline to open government. Now, what happened is that over the years, it flourished. It's a private nonprofit. It's not a government organization, and it flourished primarily due to private donations. But last year, those private donations began to dry up. And they began to dry up because in the post-pandemic world and in our increasingly polarized political environment, people were no longer donating to what shall I call it? We're no longer donating to the infrastructure of government. They wanted their dollars placed directly instead into political campaigns. They were in the heat of the battle. And so while more and more money, special interest money, private money of all sorts, flowed into political campaigns, fewer and fewer dollars went into enterprises like Wisconsin Eye. And so in November, they sent a letter of warning. They warned the legislature. They cautioned, they pleaded for help. They said, we are going to go dark if we don't get some state help and some state funding. That that letter, those pleas fell on deaf ears almost, and Wisconsin I did indeed go dark for a little while. On December 15th. I think they went dark for a month, maybe 6 weeks. The legislature then finally did come through with some emergency funding while everyone searched for a long-term solution. Now, what was interesting to me was the reaction of lawmakers when the word got out that Wisconsin I was on hard times, the funding model no longer worked. You had some lawmakers, some primarily older Republican lawmakers. Well, we don't need Wisconsin I. Why doesn't the legacy media step in and just do better reporting? Yeah, right. And then we had Democrats, of course. You can always count on the progressives to come through with the tried and true government solution. They said, well, now it's time, if Wisconsin I is on the rocks, it's time to create a Wisconsin version of NPR, public broadcasting. We'll have a public affairs network owned and operated by the government, and we'll set up this giant bureaucracy to run it, and we'll have a board of directors, and we'll put all sorts of progressives on this board of directors, and we'll have a real neutral time of it, won't we? That didn't fly, of course, especially not in a Republican-dominated legislature. So as time went on, though, I will say that there has been, on the left and the right, a sentiment that we want this kind of coverage. We don't want to see this in a state that has been proud of its openness. It's been unwarranted over the last 20 years, but proud of its openness traditionally. And you've got something that is so stellar a network as Wisconsin I, you don't want to see it go dark. So in the assembly, they came up with a version. They were going to put together a $10 million endowment, not a big fund, to help Wisconsin I out. Now, to go back just a step, there had been $10 million for Wisconsin I put in the previous state budget, but there was a trick to that. There was a glitch to that, actually. I shouldn't say a trick. It was a glitch to that in that the state would give Wisconsin I up to $10 million, but Wisconsin I had to match it. So to get the money, they had to raise private money to match it, but they couldn't use that private money for operational costs. They had to put it in the endowment. So therefore, they were raising money for the endowment, but then they had no money to operate with, and so they were kind of caught in a catch-22 situation, if you will. So in this go-round, the idea was they would set up a nearly $10 million endowment. I think there was going to be some emergency funding along the way to keep them going because they are in danger right now of going dark again. And I'll get to that in just a second. But they were going to, and so the Wisconsin I then would put together this $10 million in the endowment, and Wisconsin I could use an amount not greater than the interest on the endowment every year for operational cost. As some lawmakers pointed out, that would still leave them needing to go out and raise probably several $100,000 a year to meet their $900,000, $1 million budget as it seems to be. So that actually passed the assembly 96-0. Can you believe it? Since when do you get a 96-0 vote in the Wisconsin assembly? So everything seemed to be going great, but it wasn't, because in the Senate, there were different ideas. And again, what they were proposing in the Senate wasn't necessarily bad. Julian Bradley, the senator from New Berlin, he had a bill, and that bill was that we will fund a public affairs networks along the lines of Wisconsin I, but let's put out requests for proposals. Why are we just going to automatically give it to Wisconsin I? Let's put it out there. Let's see who bids. Let the best guy win, and we'll go from there. Each of these bills, by the way, had safeguards. That would ensure that whoever came in would operate this along the lines that it has been in the past. Now, you could make an argument for and against the Senate version. well, Wisconsin I has done great in the past. Why rock the boat? But again, you also understand the competitive impulse. We always believe as conservatives in competition, so why not open it up? And probably nobody would compete with Wisconsin I anyway, although you could have some progressive organization or other organization come in and try to low bid, and they're not really intending on being nonpartisan. And sure, you have safeguards in place, but over time, a group might come in and say, well, we can whittle those away. But anyway, it was far different from the assembly version. And the assembly, of course, adjourned and went home. And this week, the Senate is meeting. Now, I just checked here. The Senate could take up that bill or another bill, or they could pass the assembly version, or they may not get to Wisconsin I at all. And that they're likely going to adjourn this week. So if they don't pass something, and if we don't get a reconciled bill, which it doesn't look like we're going to get, then there's no funding for Wisconsin I. And how long does Wisconsin I have? Well, not very long. The group put out a update this week saying, if we don't get this funding along, either the assembly version or the assembly version, or they prefer a hybrid version, if we don't get something, then we doubt we can make it through March and April. And so things will likely go dark again, and unless something drastically happens this week, which right now it doesn't look like. We hope it will. But here's the thing. Wisconsin I is an issue in and of itself. We want to preserve it. We want to preserve that lever of transparency that it gives us, that ability to look inside and actually attend meetings in this digital age. But what we have to understand is that transparency, our transparency needs in this state, does not stop with such infrastructure. We have deeper problems with that than that. And the problem is we have a legislative culture that is inherently against open government. They hate openness. They're for secrecy. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrats or Republicans. They both have spent the last 20 years doing everything they can to shut the doors of government on the people of the state of Wisconsin. I chronicled this in Dark State, but now we saw their true colors begin to emerge one more time when Wisconsin I went dark in December. Well, it wasn't long after that some lawmakers decided, well, we'll just film and record the sessions ourselves, perhaps for their constituents, who knows. And then the GOP leadership suddenly discovered, lo and behold, there's a long-standing rule that the public could not come in and record most legislative sessions and floor sessions, including lawmakers. Couldn't do it. One Democratic lawmaker was shut down. He live streamed one day, couldn't do it the next. And so the immediate response of lawmakers in this fiasco, in this catastrophe, was not only when they went dark, was to shut down the ability of Wisconsinites to access what they were doing even more. They've got a long history of doing this. We must go back and remember that in 2015, late on a Friday night, it was the GOP that tried to repeal virtually the entire open records law in the state, and they were hoping to release that on the weekend and get away with it. But the media did get a hold of it, and the public did too, and there was such a fierce backlash that they quickly backed down. But they will and Democrats aren't innocent either, by the way. They're just as bad. Governor Evers is the worst governor for transparency that we have ever had, and I just don't have the time to go into all of it. Let's just suffice it to say that both parties should be ashamed and embarrassed by their records on open government. And the latest nonsense with shutting down recordings in the state house was just another example of this. But it goes back to what I was saying. The heart of the problem is the overwhelming need for reform of our open government laws, because the reason that lawmakers were able to have a rule prohibiting recording in the first place is because they conveniently, years ago, exempted themselves from the open records retention law and the open meetings law. If you ask a lawmaker if they have to abide by the public records law, they will say, of course we do. And technically, they are right. They do. But what they don't have to abide by is the open records retention law, which requires that public officials, state officials, and local officials too maintain these records, don't destroy them, don't throw them out for a period of time. In most cases, that's 7 years. Lawmakers exempted themselves from that. And here's the importance behind that. If a lawmaker has a document that you want and you make an open records request for it and they have it, they have to give it to you because they are under the open records law. But of course, if they destroyed it the night before, there's no record to give to you, and that's perfectly legal for them to do. So that's the kind of shenanigans that go on. And as far as the open meetings law, they are just totally brazen about not being subject to that. And if they were subject to the open meetings law, they could not bar the public from recording sessions, because under the open meeting statute, the public shall have the right to record so long as they don't obstruct a meeting in progress. So this problem puts a bad light on one particular situation, but it goes back to the real need we have in this state to overhaul our entire open government's laws. We need to put the legislature under the open records and open meetings law, but there's a whole slew of reforms we need relating to digital records, relating to costs for records. We have now just school districts and other local governments trying to charge thousands of dollars for releasing records. We have a mess when it comes to open government in Wisconsin. This shines a light on it. And we really need to, as we go through this Sunshine Week, we need to really turn to people running for the legislature and ask them, these other issues are really, really important. PFAS is really, really important. It sure is. But so is open government. And we need to recruit candidates, and we need to ask those who are running, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stand up as Senator Chris Larson has done for so long and say, we need to end these exemptions? Yes, I know Chris Larson is a Looney Tune, but on this issue, he is right. And we need to take it seriously, because it's all about process and due process. And democratic due process cannot continue so long as we have a mess, which is what we call open government in Wisconsin right now. Now, I want to move real quickly here today to one other thing I wrote in the McIver Institute, McIverInstitute.com. You can read my stuff over there as well as on Substack. And I wrote how we should not trust the state's public trust doctrine. And I did so. The thrust of this, you can read it, but the thrust of this is really that our public trust doctrine, which according to the state constitution, really keeps our waters, the waters of the state, open for the public forever, for free, no taxes, no fees to use them. You can't obstruct for navigation or recreation or transportation. And that's what the Constitution says. The public trust doctrine, as we know it today, has been so transformed that it is totally out of whack with the original intent and text of the Constitution. It's totally unconstitutional. It's grown beyond its borders. They use it now to enact shoreland zoning laws on shore, affecting property development on the shorelands. It was never intended for that. It was never intended to be a constitutional mandate for water quality and developmental and controlling development on the shoreland. They've attached now the absurd concept of natural scenic beauty. The Public Trust Doctrine protects our natural scenic beauty. Nobody said that in the Constitution. Nowhere was it even hinted at when they put that into the Constitution. It was built as activist judges over years rewrote our Constitution, adding all this junk to it, and all to pursue a progressive agenda of shutting down shoreland development. Now, as I point out in the article, I'm not advocating that we don't regulate shoreland development. I'm all for water quality. I don't want filthy waters. But what I am saying is that we need to reject the more extremist formulations. Back during the Doyle years, we had an assistant attorney general who actually ran for the Supreme Court, Joanne Kloppenberg, who compared shoreland cottages to junkyards and salvage yards and said, we don't tolerate junkyards. Why would we tolerate cottages on the shore? And they've used the Public Trust Doctrine to kind of try and do away with all that. So the reason we can have shoreland statutes, we can have setbacks, we can have limits on impervious surfaces, but we need to do it not through the Constitution, but through the permissible state police power known as zoning, whereby, what's the difference? The difference is one is a constitutional mandate which can be blown out of proportion by activist judges. The other subjects the whole process to local democratic decision making. If it's Constitution, you can't repeal or amend a statute on shoreland development. But if it's a statute, you sure can. And people can get involved and decide what is appropriate for their community. Now, I have an example of this, and one of the thrusts that I had in this article was that one of the things that makes the current interpretation of the Public Trust Doctrine unconstitutional is that the doctrine itself, much to the dismay, I'm sure, of the DNR, actually prevents the DNR from protecting all the waters of the state. Now, they argue, and they enacted shoreland zoning as a public trust responsibility. The Public Trust Doctrine, the DNR will tell you, the state will tell you, requires this comprehensive shoreland zoning for the entire state within the shoreland zone so that we protect, we develop, we limit impervious surfaces, we limit development so as to protect water quality. The problem with that, if you go by the current interpretation, is that incorporated cities and villages are exempt from, by magic apparently, are exempt from the shoreland zoning ordinance. So you have communities in rural areas, they can only have 15% impervious surfaces or 30% with mitigation. But in urban areas, in cities and villages, you have completely different standards. Some are very strict. Some are very loose. Some don't even directly regulate impervious surfaces. They use density and stormwater regulations. It all adds up to a patchwork of regulation, not a comprehensive plan. And it inhibits the DNR if you can't regulate those things in those shoreland zones. If you can't regulate impervious surfaces in municipalities and cities to the same standards you can in rural areas, you are not implementing a comprehensive plan. And by their own argument, that makes the whole exemption for municipalities and cities unconstitutional. So if you're going to cling to this interpretation of the Constitution, you have to end that exemption. And I'll give you one quick example here, which paints the whole thing. It shows how absurd it is. Up in Oneida County, in the city of Rhinelander, there's a lake called Boom Lake. Boom Lake lies partly in the city of Rhinelander and partly in the unincorporated area of Oneida County. The unincorporated part is subject to the standards of the DNR shoreland zoning in R115, while the city part is not, and they're completely different regulations. You have the same watershed, you have the very same lake, different regulations. Why is one area, why is one part of the lake suitable for different zoning, for different regulations than the other part of the lake? And it just shows how absurd this whole thing is. When the DNR talks about, well, they have one other point to make about this, the DNR will tell you, well, yeah, they're exempt from the NR 115, but they have other regulations. They have stormwater regulations and those kind of things, density regulations, and that indirectly regulates the impervious surfaces. The problem with that is they haven't worked. They haven't worked for years. The DNR itself will tell you that the key to water quality in the state is impervious surfaces near the shoreland zone, near the water. And the science has been pretty steady throughout the years that the water quality in watersheds, and you scale it on a watershed level, the water quality begins to degrade at about 10 to 12% of impervious surface coverage in that watershed. Now, if you take a look at northern Wisconsin, there is 2% or less, actually, of impervious surface cover in northern Wisconsin. But go down south to Milwaukee, to Madison, to those areas, and what you actually have is like far greater than when water starts to degrade. The DNR will say water starts to degrade at 10 to 12% impervious surfaces. They've blown past that. Milwaukee has years and years ago. And now they still have impervious surface exemptions to allow for more develop in the very areas that shouldn't be, according to them. So if we're going to be consistent, then really we should end those exemptions for cities and villages. What really should happen is that the Public Trust Doctrine should be pared back to its original jurisdiction to protect navigation. It was all about navigation, protect navigation on the state's waters, the lakes and the rivers, so that you can't obstruct navigation, you can't obstruct transportation, you can't obstruct the public's use for recreation or commerce, but do away with all this other stuff and then let communities go out through their zoning powers and regulate as they see fit, because you won't have 10 to 12% impervious surfaces in northern Wisconsin for the next 400 years, if then. The strictest regulations now apply to the area that doesn't need them. The most lenient are in the areas that do. And so we need to take a look at this public trust doctrine. Again, it is something that the current Supreme Court has got a case coming to it that they may be able to expand it once again, and something that we need to take a look at because it endangers our private property rights. I think I will stop there for today. Oh, no, I won't. I've got one other topic to cover. And let me just pull it up here very quickly if you'll stay with me and excuse myself with Sunshine Week. We need to talk about Donald Trump. I've heard all week how bad for transparency Donald Trump is, how bad for transparency the Trump administration is. And it's just not true. I will point out to you this. First of all, Trump himself it's absurd to say that he's not a transparent guy. You can't shut the guy up, especially around the press. And even if he contradicts himself every 15 minutes or decides he thinks something else down later in the day, he nonetheless does a lot more talking to the press and answers a lot more questions from the press than Joe Biden ever dreamed of doing in one day. In his 4 years, Donald Trump does in one day. Those of us who admire the president and those of us who have followed the president know that through the years, you do not listen necessarily to what Trump says. You look at what he and his administration do. And on those scores, transparency has been very, very, he's done a lot for transparency. Let's put it that way. One thing that I will mention is regulatory reform. There's such a thing in regulations called notice and comment, so that when bureaucracies want to issue a new rule or regulation or repeal a rule or regulation, the federal bureaucracy has to issue notice and comment. You have to give the public a certain amount of time to comment on the proposed rule, and then you weigh, and then they say, well, we'll make amendments or we won't, and then they pass the rule. Now, what has happened over the years is that progressives have taken the notice and comment period and destroy it for true public input. They organize, these environmental groups particularly, organize these mass campaigns, and they write form letters, and they deluge the bureaucracy during the notice and comment period, and they bog it down. And they do the same thing when you try to repeal a rule. And this is where what the Trump administration has been trying to do is so important. The progressives have attacked the Trump administration because he's trying to cut back on these notice and comment periods, not during the front end where you're trying to put a rule into effect, but on the back end where you're trying to repeal a rule. And so these environmental groups are organizing these massive campaigns to bog down the process. And the Trump administration has recognized that for what it is. It's become a disingenuous tool of the collectivist bureaucracy. It's another projection of due process that actually thwarts due process. And so he's trying to get rid of it, at least on the back end. And that's an important caveat again, because no matter what you hear in the corporate media, it is the repeal of unlawful regulations that Trump is aiming to streamline the process and actually would ensure more public comment. So in this whole notice and comment process, the Trump administration reforms would push aside the special interest groups, make it possible to have reasonable input from the real public groups, and enhance transparency in the process. But I think the most important thing to know about the Trump administration is that in terms of transparency, is look what the president and his administration has exposed in the little over a year that they've been back in office. The biggest the biggest thing I can think of, the biggest thing I can tell you is they have exposed the nonprofit sector. They've exposed the grant economy for what it is, a pipeline by which foundations, by which foreign organizations and special interest, elite groups channel money, and bureaucracies themselves channel money into the nonprofit sector to pursue ideological goals at street level. That's what the grant economy and the nonprofit economy are all about. And you have seen with your very eyes, we have all seen with our very eyes, the president exposing that. He's fired a missile right into the belly of their infrastructure and hasn't destroyed that infrastructure yet, but he has certainly made it hard for anyone not to notice what is going on in the nonprofit sector. I'll be back later this week with another podcast, as well as some more written stuff. I hope you subscribe to Substack. I hope if you have friends, you'll pass this Substack along, share the link. And I hope you're digging out from the snow. I wish everybody a good Wednesday and rest of the week. I'm Richard Moore.